Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's workshop on how to peer review for a scholarly journal hosted by the South African Journal of Science. We hope that you find the discussions and the presentations today useful and informative. I would just like to start off by introducing myself. I am Nadia Grobler, and I'm the Online Publishing Systems Administrator for the South African Journal of Science, and I will be facilitating the workshop today. So before we jump right into the program, I would just like to point out two things. So first of all, this meeting or this workshop is being recorded, and it will be made available on our SAJS YouTube channel after the workshop has ended. And then also, if you have any questions to ask for the speakers in the duration of the workshop, please pop them into the Q&A box, which is located in the middle at the bottom of your screen. So yeah, we will try and get as much of these answered as we possibly can. And yeah, that is it for the formalities. So let me start off then by introducing our first speaker, who is Dr. Gemma Finch. So Dr. Gemma Finch is a senior lecturer in geography at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. She holds a PhD from the University of York in the UK. Following her PhD, Gemma returned to South Africa as a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Cape Town before taking up a lectureship at UKZ in 2011. A paleoecologist by training, Gemma uses plant and animal remains preserved in sediments to understand past climate and environmental change. Gemma is a NRF C2 rated scientist and is the recipient of the 2021 UKZN Vice-Chancellor's Research Award. She is an associate editor for the South African Journal of Science in the field of archaeology, anthropology, and paleontology. She teaches undergraduate biogeography and environmental change and has special interests in fieldwork-based training and in developing scientific writing skills. Thank you very much, Gemma. I am handing over to you.
Approaches to peer review that are starting to be adopted by some journals, because I think it's important, especially since we have a young audience here, to be aware of some of these new forms of peer review that are being trialed. Then I'll get to the meat of the presentation, which is what you all want to know. When you receive that invitation to peer review, should you accept? Should you decline? What are the considerations? So I'll go into that in some detail. One of the main considerations around accepting an invitation to peer review is the idea of conflicts of interest. So that I'm going to cover in some detail. I then want to summarize for you some of the reasons why we would encourage you to start peer reviewing, some of the benefits to you as a scientist, and then just some closing remarks. So first of all, what is peer review and what is peer review aiming to achieve? Now, according to this quote by Cargill and O'Connor, really peer review here centers around quality assurance and quality control, checking the quality of a manuscript before it is published and before it is released to a wider audience. So this we can think of as a gatekeeping exercise. And I think this echoes many people's perceptions of what peer review is, checking quality control before allowing publication to take place. But I think we can all agree that peer review has some other functions as well. So this paper recently by Baldwin actually ends off by questioning some of the goals and purposes of peer review. She questions whether the main goal of peer review should be about ensuring scientific quality, so that gatekeeping function that I've just mentioned, or whether it should be about selecting the most innovative and the most novel research for publication. Or finally, whether peer review should be about giving feedback and improving the quality of that research output. And I think this will vary between different journals as to where the focus lies. But I think ideally, of course, it is about many of these things. It's about ensuring rigorous scientific quality, but also about constructive criticism and improving the quality of the research. So on that note, I refer here to the guidelines for reviewers from the South African Journal of Science. And from this journal's point of view, I think it's very clear from the first point that SAJS has a sort of dual goal in terms of peer review, which is firstly about using experts to help discern the quality and the appropriateness of a particular manuscript for publication, so around quality control, but also about giving feedback to improve the quality of those manuscripts before they are published. So that's quite a balanced approach. There are other guidelines here, which I won't go into too much detail because I don't want to steal too much thunder from the presentation still to come. But some other guidelines which I thought were worth highlighting from SAJS were to always be collegial in a peer review report. So to keep things positive and not to overly criticize or include any offensive remarks, for example. Then the third point there highlights the fact that peer review can identify the weaknesses of a submitted manuscript, but it should also take a constructive tone in highlighting where there are areas for improvement. Again, quite a balanced approach coming through. And then finally, ending on a positive note, one goal of peer review here is to identify the strong points of a piece of research and highlight the most valuable aspects of that manuscript. So in an ideal world, we would want the peer review process to be fair and unbiased, to be scientifically rigorous, to be constructive and improve the quality of the research, but always to remain confidential as well. And that last point is not an ideal of peer review. It is mandatory, it's a must. So the peer review process should always remain entirely confidential. So this is what goes on behind the scenes in terms of the submission process for a manuscript. So from the journal's perspective, first of all, an author submits their manuscript for consideration for publication, starting here on the left-hand side. So that manuscript is received for consideration. It is then assessed by the editor. And if that manuscript is not appropriate for that particular journal, then the editor may choose to desk reject. And we go down to the bottom left-hand corner here. So that is a desk rejection, is a rejection without going to peer review. If, however, the manuscript can be considered for peer review and maybe later publication, it will then proceed to the next stage, which is where the editor identifies potential reviewers. Normally it's a pool of potential reviewers who have the necessary expertise to conduct the review on this particular field of inquiry, who don't have any particular conflicts of interest with the author group. And then the editor will send out invitations to peer review. And we don't send out loads and loads of invitations at a time. Normally we'll invite 2 or 3 reviewers in the hope that we can secure the 2 or 3 acceptances that we might require going forward. So those invitations are sent out, and then we wait to see whether the potential peer reviewer will accept or decline, and then we will invite more reviewers as need be. Once we have sent out and reviewers have accepted the invitation to peer review, they conduct their peer review and send back the peer review reports, The editor will then look through those reports and assess the situation and use those reports to help inform decision making. Usually, the editor will base this on 2 or 3 reports, depending on the journal, but that's a common number. For SAJS, we usually use 2 reports. So the editor will take those reports, use that to inform their decision making, and decide whether the manuscript should be accepted, whether it should be rejected, or whether there are revisions required. And if those revisions are required, the peer review reports are sent back to the author. The author then has the opportunity to revise their manuscript, respond to the reviewers if there are certain items that they won't be changing, but they need to respond or rebut against, and then submit a revised manuscript and a response to the reviewers back to the editor. And you can see this becomes a bit of an iterative process at times, because sometimes even after those revised manuscripts are received, perhaps they need to go back out to peer review for checking. Another thing that can happen is that at this stage here, where the editor receives the peer review reports, the editor might see that you have conflicting opinions in those peer review reports. One peer reviewer says, this is fantastic, accept without changes, and the other one says, reject, there's fatal flaws. That's an extreme example, but the point is we do often get conflicting peer review reports. And in that case, it might be necessary to go and secure additional reviews. So you have to go back a step, invite somebody else, and get an additional peer review report to help assess the situation. So that's the general process behind the scenes. And I think it's useful both as an author who's submitting their manuscripts for consideration, but also as a peer reviewer on the other side to have some appreciation of what is going on behind the scenes. Something to highlight here in this yellow block, although it's only a single block in the flowchart, this particular stage can take a very long time, because the reality is that for every peer review invitation that gets sent out, many are not responded to. The potential peer reviewer might take a very long time to respond. Many will decline the invitation. Sometimes those who accept the invitation end up not coming through with their peer review reports. So even though we invite very many, it's all in an attempt to secure those 2 peer review reports at the end. And sometimes that process takes a very long time. And I already spoke about the fact that in some cases we might need additional reviews in the case of conflicting reports. On this subject of the peer review process, we need to be aware that there are different models of peer review. So we have single anonymous, where the author's name is known to the reviewer, but the reviewer remains anonymous to the author. So that's fairly common. Other journals will use a double anonymous model, and in this case, both the reviewer's names and the author's names are kept anonymous. So neither the author nor the reviewer knows who's on the other end. And then we have a more open model where both the author and the reviewer's names are shared and revealed. So these are the main models of peer review that are out there. I mentioned that there are also experimental and novel forms of peer review that are being tested by some journals or being trialed by some journals, and I think it's useful to be aware of these. So there's the consensus report, where you have essentially the referees or reviewers work together with the editor to produce a single consensus report, a single set of critiques to which the authors then respond. So in this case, because the editors and the reviewers are talking together, we don't generally get a case of huge conflicts. What gets sent back to the author is more streamlined, if you like. So that's one model. Another is collaborative review, where you have the authors, the editors, and the reviewers all exchanging recommendations and responses. So they're almost collaborating towards this peer review process. And then we have an open peer review model where the journal publishing house will publish the manuscript online, and the reviews are then done post-publication and also published online. So everything is quite transparent and publicly available. So these are some of the new ways of peer review that we are seeing emerging amongst some publishers. So onto probably what you all want to know. Once you've been invited to review a manuscript for publication, what do you do? How do you make a decision whether to accept or decline an invitation to review? And I think there's three major considerations, three big questions you need to ask yourself. So the first one is they will usually send you a title, an abstract for the manuscript. You need to go over those and check to see whether you have the necessary expertise to review the paper. In other words, is it in your field? Is this your specialization, broadly speaking? I think that's the first place to start. The second thing is, in that peer review invitation, there will be an allocated time frame. The particular publisher or journal will say in their invitation, if you accept, you have 2 weeks to complete the review, or you have 10 days or 30 days. It varies from journal to journal. You need to look at that time frame, look at your own workload, and realistically ask yourself if you can manage this additional commitment. Because these peer review invitations arrive in your inbox out of nowhere. It's not something that you plan for. So you need to ask yourself whether this is something that you can manage. And then importantly, whether there is a conflict of interest. Do you have a conflict of interest either with authors or with the type of research that's being done? I'm going to expand upon that in the next point. So if you can answer yes to all of these questions, this is in my field, there aren't any conflicts of interest, and I can manage the workload, then you can accept that invitation if you want to. Okay, you have the option then to accept the invitation. However, if to one or more of these questions the answer is a no, there are conflicts of interest, or this is outside of my field of expertise, or I'm actually overcommitted at the moment and I would be seriously stretching myself, I'm not sure that I can manage within the timeframes available, then it's worth declining that invitation to review. When you decline, respond with an email that just briefly gives the reason why you're declining. I think it's useful to provide an editor with that context. It's helpful for them as well. And what's really helpful is if you can suggest alternative reviewers if you are aware of them. So it may be that the particular manuscript that has been sent to you as an invitation, it's not quite within your field, but you know of other scientists who have a good fit. You can suggest those scientists to the editor as potential reviewers. And that's really, really helpful, because if you remember that flow chart, those editors are always battling to find peer reviewers. They're battling to find appropriate and willing peer reviewers who also then submit their peer review reports on time. So suggesting alternative reviewers is a big help. So either way, whether it's a yes or a no, whether you're going to accept or decline that invitation to review, try to do so as quickly as possible. Remember that that process and that particular part of the process is quite cumbersome and time-consuming. It's one of the things that slows down the overall publication process. And I think it's always nice to remember the author sitting on the other end, essentially sitting in the dark, waiting, not sure exactly what's happening with their paper. And the longer you sit on an invitation without responding, the more you are contributing to delaying that process. So try to respond as quickly as possible. Some other notes on the invitation and communication with the editors. I think it's really good to communication with the editors. So you may accept a peer review invitation, but your situation changes. You can no longer manage the workload for whatever reason, or you have a personal issue and can't do it, or you need an extension. Email the editor, tell them what's going on. Either withdraw at that point from the peer review process, or perhaps be granted an extension. It's very common to be granted an extension, a short extension, to get these reports in if you are invested in the process. So keep those open lines of communication. Sometimes I see this question coming up on academic Twitter: how many reviews should I be accepting? Well, it's a tricky one, but I think one of the most common answers anyway that I see is to almost work on a quid pro quo or tit for tat system, where for every manuscript that you put out there for review, so every manuscript you submit, you should then also accept a peer review invitation, so that you are giving back in that sense. If you want to do more than that, that's even better, but sometimes the load of reviewing papers can be quite heavy, and I think 1 for 1 is very fair. How much time should you spend on a peer review? That question also comes up very often, and I think perhaps the next speaker will give you more insight into this. But from my side, the answers I see to this range generally around a few hours. So some people who are more experienced or who have shorter papers to review might be able to do it in 2 to 3 hours. Others, it might take them 6 to 8 hours. Depends on the individual's level of experience, the type of paper, and so on. But as I say, more insight in the next presentation on that point. Okay, so importantly then, what is a conflict of interest? Some of these are fairly obvious, but let's just summarize them anyway. If you know who the author is, if it's a close friend or a close acquaintance, a family member, then it puts you in a difficult position to provide an unbiased review. So that constitutes a conflict of interest. Similarly, if you've recently collaborated or co-authored with the authors, that would be a conflict of interest. What is recent? 5 years is a fair time frame for that. The authors are based at the same institution or the same department. That would be considered potentially a conflict of interest. Finally, your lab is competing with their lab with a similar research agenda, similar research interests. You're competing with one another. That's definitely a conflict of interest. So these are different types of conflicts of interest. As I say, some of them are fairly obvious, but others it's good to be reminded of. And these are taken into account when the editor actually selects those reviewers to invite. So generally we would screen potential reviewers for this, but we might not know all the information. So we'll screen as best we can. I think it's important to be aware that there are exceptions here. So it may be that you are in a very small field where co-authorship is going to happen because there's a small pool of specialists available in this particular field. That happens. So there are exceptions here. And I think the important thing is to be open with the editor, declare your potential conflict of interest, let the editor decide. Okay, that's a good approach, but rather declare any potential conflict of interest up front. Okay, why should you peer review? Well, first of all, it's a great way to develop your critical thinking skills. So it will change the way that you think as a scientist and actually end up improving your own work. If you're supervising, it will help you improve your supervision skills as well. These critical thinking skills are really core to what we do as scientists. It helps you stay current in your field. When you are reviewing the work of others, it allows you to see what's being done, who's being cited, where are the new developments. It's a really good way to stay current. So I think it almost keeps your finger on the pulse. You know what's going on in your field. So peer review is great for that. It also is something that you can add to your CV. So as early career researchers, we want to put as much on our CVs as possible, competing for limited postdoc funding, or perhaps you're applying for an academic position, anything in research. It's useful to keep a list on your CV, not of the papers that you've published, because obviously that's confidential, but you can list the journals that you have reviewed for. So any journals that you have reviewed for, you can list those in your CV. And that's a nice way of showing that you have reviewed for multiple journals and that you're starting to gain a reputation as a potential peer reviewer, as a scientist in your field who's known and who can be found and relied upon to peer review. So that's a good way of enhancing your CV. You can also track your peer reviews using a platform like Publons, which I think has been incorporated into Web of Science now. So if you have a researcher ID account, you can track your peer review activity and show which journals, a sort of verified record of which journals you have reviewed for on your Web of Science profile. And then really importantly, and more altruistically, peer reviewing is your service to the academic community. So as I say, if you are submitting manuscripts for consideration for publication, others are investing their time and effort, and peer reviewing takes time, into giving you constructive feedback and improving your work. You should be doing the same as a peer reviewer for others. And it's a sort of, I guess, a paid forward system in a way. Okay, so to close off then, do you feel ready to review? Are you ready to review? Well, I would strongly encourage you to start reviewing and to start thinking about accepting invitations to peer review. As I said, this is an important service within the academic community, and there are a number of benefits to you as an individual and your academic development. But by accepting an opportunity to peer review, you are also improving representation within the scientific field, improving diversity and inclusivity, and adding your voice essentially to the scientific community. And I think that's really important. So we want diverse voices to be participating in this process and moving science forward. And we all have to start somewhere. So we know about imposter syndrome, it's rife, and you may not feel quite ready. Remember, if you're doing a PhD in a field, by the time you get to the end of that PhD, you're probably one of the world experts in that field. So don't doubt yourself. We do all have to start somewhere. And if you're really unsure or nervous, one option is to use a mentorship approach where, with prior permission from the publishers, you could work together with a supervisor or a mentor to help review a paper. And that's a really good place to start and a good way to learn. So I hope that you will positively consider the opportunity to peer review next time you get the opportunity or get an invitation landing in your inbox. I think it's an important process, and there are lots of potential benefits both to you, but also to helping the academic community moving forwards. So thank you very much to everybody for listening.
Thank you very much, Gemma, for giving us such a good overview of the review process and things to consider when you do receive an invitation. I think people who might be new to this process have really learned a lot. I have also learned a few things. So we do have time for one quick question. And there is one which I think is quite applicable to your presentation. So let me just get that. So apologies if I mispronounce your name, but it's from Simanhle Maisela. So he asks, sometimes when we submit an article, we are requested to send a list of suggested reviewers. Doesn't that present a possible conflict of interest?
I don't think so, because you are submitting that list of potential reviewers back to the editor. So the editor's not going to take that list and start at the top and work down without scrutinizing who's on the list. It helps us, it gives us ideas, but the first thing we'll do is check the Google Scholar profile. We will check the person's homepage on their institution. We'll see what they've published, who they've worked with, obviously check their expertise, but we will ourselves vet that conflict of interest. So for me, because I'm relatively new to this, I make a spreadsheet of everybody that I want to invite as a peer reviewer, also just to try and keep track and remember who's who. And then I'll populate that with all the details. Have they published with the first author on the manuscript? Have they published with the second author, third author, and so on? And I'll go and I'll find all that information. I'll check their institution. I'll make notes on their expertise. So we do our own vetting process. And those suggestions are really just to give us pointers, because there might be scientists out there who we haven't considered. And yeah, we will be choosing the most appropriate of those and those that don't pose a conflict of interest.
Thanks, Gemma. I think you answered that well. So thank you, Gemma. We are going to move on to the next item on the program, and I would like to introduce the next speaker. So just to mention up front, so the next speaker is Dr. Caridee Wright. She is unfortunately not able to join us live today, but she will be joining us virtually in a sense. She's recorded her presentation for us, so that is very will still be very useful for you. So let me just introduce you to Dr. Caridee Wright. So she has a PhD in public health and is a chief specialist scientist at the South African Medical Research Council, leading the climate change and health research program. She is also an adjunct lecturer at the University of Pretoria and research associate professor at the University of Johannesburg. Her research focuses on environmental health in Africa, with a focus on understanding climate change and health impacts to inform interventions. Her expertise is in air pollution exposure and risk reduction, skin cancer prevention, and climate change adaptation. Caridee has published more than 110 research articles in accredited journals and supervises postgraduate students at multiple institutions. Among many international roles, Caridee was an author of the Africa chapter of the IPCC Assessment Report Working Group, and she was also the recipient of the SHAS Outstanding Reviewer Award for 2021. So please do allow us just a second to get the video up and running. And yes, we hope you learn a lot from this presentation.
Hi, I'm Caridee Wright from the South African Medical Research Council, affiliated with the University of Pretoria and also the University of Johannesburg. And today I'm going to talk to you about some of my experiences of writing a peer review report for a manuscript for a journal. You'll see 3 icons at the top. Those icons represent 3 different stages in this process. First is around reading, the middle part is around thinking, and then the final part is around writing. And I'll take you through that through the next slides with some illustrative examples. So you've agreed to review a manuscript for a journal. Now what? Dive right in? No, that's definitely not the best way to do it, especially if it's the first time that you're going to be reviewing a manuscript. Definitely makes more sense to formulate a plan. Sometimes that might be talking to somebody to get advice on how best to review a manuscript for a journal, or searching the internet to find some useful tips and hints on how to go about doing the review. I'm going to give some of those to you today from my own personal experience. So on this journey of reviewing, probably important to think about what is my role as a reviewer. I know that this presentation before me was how to deal with being asked to review, so actually receiving the invitation, making the decision to review, and I'm sure things have been discussed, such as making sure that you can actually competently do a review in a field of expertise that relate to your own, for example. But as a reviewer, you have to think of yourself as contributing in a way, forevermore, often unknown, to that particular manuscript that you've taken on the obligation to review. So your role really is nitty-gritty stuff like read the manuscript, consider the quality, the novelty of the research that's being presented in the manuscript, to provide constructive feedback, and we'll discuss that a little bit more just now. And ultimately, you're trying to help inform the associate editor or the editor of the journal to make a decision on whether this research in this manuscript is worthy of publication in a journal. I want to go back to what is your role as a reviewer, just from a personal experience. So in the instance when you decide to review a manuscript, and I did that, it might turn out that before you've just seen the abstract, but now you get the whole paper, and you realize that you actually can't do the review. At that stage, it is better to write back to the associate editor or whoever was asking you to do the review and honestly say that you are not capable or confident to conduct the review. You've realized, for example, that the methodology is entailing statistics that you don't understand, and it would be unfair to try and conduct a review of that manuscript. Better to contact the journal and tell them up front rather than give a half-baked review report after your attempt at reviewing the manuscript. I had another thought, but it might come to me just now. I can't think of it right now, but I had another example about role as reviewer, and I'll mention it when it pops up in my brain in a moment. So the review itself is multi-stage, and what I usually do is I start first off by reading the entire manuscript. So I am a little bit old school, and this doesn't have to happen in this way. I usually print the manuscript, and with a pen or a piece of paper, I read and I make notes to myself. It becomes a little bit of a mess, but it's really my very first read of this manuscript. And at that point, there's some things that you're going to be realizing, and that's on the next slide. So what to think about on that very first read. What is the story here? At the end of the day, every manuscript's goal is to tell a story, to take the reader on a journey of the research that they set out to achieve, to answer a research question, to fulfill an hypothesis, for example. So what is the story? Can I get a sense of the story? Is it clear? Is the story not really making sense? Is it confusing? That's my first thought. Then it would be, am I enjoying reading this manuscript? Remember, at the end of the day, we all want to try and write well, and when you're reading a manuscript that's written well, it becomes enjoyable because you don't have to focus on what is this person trying to say in this sentence because of language or grammar issues, for example. A good one is, how many times do I get agitated? Things that agitate me when I read a manuscript for the first time would be there's an abbreviation that's not been written out in full, so I actually don't know what the authors are talking about. Or they keep making the same mistake, the same spelling mistake even. Not that that's my job, and we'll talk about that later on. But little things like that. On the flip side, this might also be useful for you as a writer, by the way, this talk, because of course we are all submitting manuscripts as well. And then the last question I sometimes think about is, how many times do I ask a question of the manuscript in front of me that doesn't seem to be answered as I read more? So, for example, I'm reading something and I go, now I wonder how they did that, or why did they choose that? And I'll go back and see what I've read, and then I'll bear it in mind as I go forward, and at no point is that answered. And I always tell my students, when you're writing a manuscript, try and think of yourself as the reviewer who's asking the questions for the details that might just be sitting in your own head and between the lines instead of on the page. So then if we go back to this multi-stage review process, in the second stage, I read it again, most of the time on paper. So the paper copy, which has got a whole lot of scribble all over it. But I don't start from the beginning. I start with the results. I interrogate the results to think about, what are these results telling me? What are the statistical things that are going on here? What techniques have they used? Does this result set come together to tell a story? And then I go back to the end of usually the end of the introduction, and I see, what was their aim? What were their objectives or research question? And I think about, are the results talking to that? And then I read the abstract again and the conclusion, because those are the two parts where an author or authors bring together the gist of the story. And the gist of the story has to talk through the results to the aim and the objectives and come together in a nice, succinct way in the abstract and conclusion, probably the two most tricky things to write in a manuscript. And at that point, I think there's also a little bit of a pause, because you're now reflecting on the manuscript in its entirety. You know that there are nitty-gritty things that need to be resolved, but you've also identified some high-level general challenges or issues or things that need clarification, that don't make sense to you. So at this point, you're probably ready to start with your third stage of the review process, which is generating your report. And this would either be in a file, or if you're going to do it on paper, so that you then transfer it into a file, but you plan to draft your actual review. On this note, usually I take a break between my first read, particularly if the paper is going to be a bit of a challenging one, and my second read. But my second read and my writing up of my report I do close together, because it becomes difficult if you leave too much time between the second read and writing, because you forgot, well, I can forget what I was thinking about when I made a particular comment. At this stage, this is a hint, you already have a very good sense or feeling about this manuscript. You have a feeling, okay, I can see the story here. The authors have done their very best to bring it together with a golden thread that links results to the question, to the conclusion and the abstract. And I can see how the methodology worked. This makes the review much easier. Unless, of course, your feeling is below zero. In other words, negative. That then makes sitting down for that second and third phase that much more challenging, because a review can take time. Maybe that's something I wanted to say up front about my role as a reviewer. There is a commitment to time. A useful review for an editor is meaningful. Often that's more than one page. We'll talk about number of pages just now, but providing a very cursory, high-level, non-specific review is not usually useful for an editor, and it's not useful for the authors to be able to make corrections. So if you're feeling that your review is below 0, which is normally when I start to go, because this is going to take me a long time, you can then plan for when are you going to do second phase and third phase and actually put your report together. So we're talking about the report. There are a number of different things to take into consideration. Sometimes the structure of the report that you write, which you'll upload to the journal website, is a free-form report, and I'll give a structure that I follow here. Or it may be according to journal specific requirements. So they may want you to create the report, but they'll actually, in addition, on their website, be things you have to fill in online. I always go and check that first so that I can make a note of it, so that I can note some answers down. This is because if the journal does require things online and you're writing them online and the power goes out, you lose everything you've done, which isn't very useful. So it's better to write those things down. You've got them and you can copy and paste them in when you're ready to go online and submit your recommendation with your report. So if we look at how I would normally structure a report, and this is generally the rule of thumb, you start with a summary of the research. This is to show you've actually read the paper and you understand what's going on in the paper, and you give your overall impression. And this might be a sentence like, this is a very interesting paper. It reflects on some of the issues that are current in the field, and it is contributing novel knowledge or building knowledge to a knowledge base where it is needed in whatever setting. So a high-level comments after the summary of the research, which would be saying the authors considered this and looked at that and used this method and found this. So you show you understand the manuscript. The second part is the evidence and the examples. So here you would really separate out what were major issues and minor issues. So you've started with a sort of general paragraph, then you go into the high-level things. There was, say, for example, a fundamental mismatch between the conclusions of the manuscript and what was presented as the research question and the results. In other words, they came up with something completely unsubstantiated from their findings and the methodology they took to get to those findings. So that would be a really, really specific, with a specific piece of evidence that's a major issue that needs addressing. Can it be addressed? Sure. They have to relook at the conclusions and make sure that what they say in the conclusions actually speaks to what they did in the manuscript. And sometimes people have just made the mistake of thinking of what would be the next set of research, and they use that in their conclusions instead of focusing on really what have we done here. And then the last point is around, and they call it miscellaneous remarks, but this is usually the most work. This is all the other points. This is specific line, page, line, or row number, and specific things that link to the questions that I asked of myself earlier. What does this really mean? How did you get to this decision? There is more recent literature than what has been cited here, and other more specific comments that come up. But there you have to be very clear to give the evidence. So I usually write page, line, comma, whatever my challenging text is from the manuscript, and then I put my comment behind it so that it's very clear to the author what I'm meaning. I'm not going to go through this in the detail that's on this slide, but this is really breaking down the format of a peer review report in more detail. I'm sure these slides will be made available after this presentation. It's talking to what I've mentioned now. It just gives some little bit more illustration to each of those sections. The final one, which is recommendations, and the confidential comments. Those are things that don't go into your actual report. Those are things confidential that would be kept for the box online for the editor, but you write them somewhere. Just don't write them in the review file for the authors and submit it. You want to keep your comments for the editor separate from your comments for the authors. So my typical review folder file standard looks like this: the title of the manuscript. I then write reviewers' comments and the date. I give my general comments, high-level ones that we've discussed. Then I give my specific ones, page number or line number. Sometimes line numbers are continuous, so you can just give line number. You can give positive feedback too. So when they've written a really good, succinct literature piece in their introduction, say line such and such to such and such, excellent handle of the literature, bringing it together with interpretation to help inform the study. You can also give broad comments. For example, please note that the general comments made on the discussion, so this is a general comment for the discussion. Please ensure that the requests that were made for more information on questions and results in the results section feed through into the discussion. So in other words, I'm trying to urge the authors to think about what comments were made in the results and how should I reflect those comments that have now been integrated into my text in the results into the revised discussion. General length of review papers for manuscripts, I don't have an answer. I've had one that was 1 page, I've had one that was 8. It really depends on the quality of the manuscript and the amount of time I've got to put into the review. And usually I try and put at least 2 hours to give a meaningful review to a manuscript. Here are some do's and don'ts. So, never ever ever use expletives or offensive language in your review. Don't be self-promoting of your own references. This is really bad form. Some people do it, some people think it's okay. In my opinion, I don't agree with it. Never attack the authors. They're learning. They're people like us who are also writing and they're learning, and this is an opportunity they use to be able to get information to better their work. Do give concrete steps on how to improve the manuscript. Don't disclose identity in your report in any way. So make sure that you've turned off any bubbles that have got your name in them. Don't make a comment where you know somehow you realized who the author is and you mention the person's name. You are not the copy editor. That is not your job. A review is not to go through and do a spell check. If that's what you think you're going to do for a review, then that is completely misaligned to the role of a reviewer. And do imagine yourself receiving this review for one of your own manuscripts. So make sure that you are diplomatic and thoughtful as you make these remarks. Lastly, I wanted to mention that there are different types of peer review. This is where it's getting a little tricky nowadays. And I see I've just hit my 20-minute mark, so I'll be done almost in a moment or two. Just wanted to mention this. So usually we've got a single blind peer review process. That's where the reviewer might actually know who the authors are, and the author doesn't know who the reviewers are, ever. Then we've got the double blind, where the reviewer and the authors don't know each other. But in today's world, we are definitely moving in the space of open access to open peer review. And that means, first of all, we go back. Don't take on a manuscript to review if you can't do a good job, because your review is going to be made public with your name. And that's really not going to look good for your reputation if you've taken on something that you couldn't do a good job at reviewing. And then the second point is that you're going to potentially have criticism from authors or from others, other peers, other reviewers. Remember, the authors are juggling the comments of different reviewers and trying to work out how best to address those comments equally. And so Just a note on saying that we're in a new space now where we do have different types of review. You might get asked, are you happy for your name to be included? Sometimes they don't ask that at all, it just does get included. And the last one is this cascading peer review. And this is a very interesting one. It's where a manuscript goes to multiple journals, one after the other, and they get rejected many, many times. They might eventually get published, but on the part of the author, I think it's important to realize at what point should this really stop. This manuscript is not publishable. That doesn't happen often, but sometimes it is the case, and it is then not worth going through another round of review because it's likely the same reviewers are going to be asked, and they've picked up the idea that you're just trying to get it published in any journal you can. So that's it. I wanted to end on why do I review journal manuscripts. I use this as a way to keep up with the current literature in my field. I don't have very much time for reading interesting papers that come out, so I try and review for top journals where I know I can give a good review, but at the same time I can see what's going on in my space. What are the latest methods that they're using? They've brought in the latest literature in their introduction, so it brings me up to speed. It is also mandatory for me to review manuscripts for journals as part of my performance review at work. Personally, I believe we all have an obligation to do so because it supports the scientific community, and it means I can help editors and associate editors. As an associate editor for several journals, I am extremely grateful to reviewers who do a good job, provide a good report with detailed comments, and who are also willing, if there is a re-review required, to actually conduct that re-review and see how the authors have addressed the comments of the reviewer. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to any comments that you might have or queries you'd like to send my way. Thanks.
I would just like to thank Cara Dee in her absence for that wonderful presentation. I think she's given some good guidelines that one can follow to do a proper peer review. And I think what stood out for me was the fact that, yes, you know, peer review is fact checking and so forth, but it's also important to just take a step back and look at the paper in its entirety, make sure that there's logical flow to the paper as well, and that the sections speak to one another. So thank you for that. We are almost heading into our comfort break, but we do have a few minutes just for a question or so. Seeing as Cara Dee is not here in person today, I would just pose the question, perhaps the one that I was looking at, to Leslie, if that's okay. So I think there's a few questions that kind of touches on this issue. So I'm sure what Leslie answers will answer a few of your questions. So the question is this one was by an anonymous attendee. As an emerging scientist with just a few articles published, what are the criteria required to be considered to peer review articles?
Thank you. That was that's an excellent question.
You're muted.
Am I?
No, you're not muted.
Oh,
Yes, it's not muted, so perhaps it's the headphones or something else.
Something. I'll just take the headphones off. Sorry.
Oh, sorry, Leslie, I think it's my sound, sorry.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, sorry, it's because we're in the same office, so we have to switch between sounds. Apologies, everyone.
No. Listen, it's not possible to have a Zoom meeting without saying you're muted or you forgot to mute yourself, or otherwise we can't have a proper meeting. We all know this. Yeah, thank you for the question, which of course I've now forgotten. What are the qualifications to become a peer reviewer? This is something that we're going to be dealing with after the comfort break, but I think the important point that I want to make now is often people, and I will be talking about this again, but people think that your peer reviewers are some kind of special breed of person that we're more brilliant than everybody else, and so on and so forth. But in fact, the whole system, the whole science and research system, depends on what's called peer review. So you are somebody actually who is like the person, ideally quite similar to the person who is writing the article. So you have to decide on certain questions yourself. Is this a field that I know about? Am I up to date with the methods in this field? But I'm going to be talking after the break about ways in which to address that, because I've also looked, Nadia, at the questions, and obviously a number of people I think are feeling quite unconfident. Am I good enough? When will I be good enough? And at some point, you've just got to, take the plunge, as I say with academic writing as well. It's a bit like learning to ride a bicycle. You've got to get on the bicycle. If you don't start somewhere, you're not going to build up your confidence. But we'll talk about ways of dealing with that and scaffolding yourself a bit after the break. So I hope that's helpful, Nadia.
Yes, definitely. Okay, well, we are going to take a quick comfort break then, about 10 minutes or so. So if we could have everybody back 16 past to be exact, then we will see you after the break. Thank you. Okay, welcome back, everyone. I hope you've had a chance to grab yourself a coffee or to just stretch your legs before the second part of this workshop. So I would just like to start by introducing our next speaker, who is Professor Floretta Boonzaier. She is a professor of psychology at the University of Cape Town and co-director of the Hub for Decolonial Feminist Psychologies in Africa. She is also the incoming president of the Psychological Society of South Africa. She is noted for her work in feminist, critical, and post-colonial psychologies, her research on subjectivity in relation to race, gender, and sexuality, and her work on gendered and sexual violence and decolonial research methodologies. She is an associate editor of the South African Journal of Science and past editor-in-chief of the journal Psychology in Society. Thank you so much, Floretta.
Thank you, Nadia, for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation to speak. So it's my job to speak to you about now, once we have peer review reports in, how do we then make a decision on those reports? But I want to start by saying that I'm really encouraged by the amount of interest in the workshop today, given that often as when we work as editors and associate editors, we really sometimes struggle really hard to find peer reviewers. So it's very encouraging to see the number of people who are interested in the peer review process. So thank you. I look forward to also engaging with you in questions. So as has already been indicated by previous speakers, I just want to, this is just an illustration of the decision-making process as far as receiving articles for publication and managing the peer review process. So the author submits, there's an initial screening process where journal editors would screen and make a decision on whether this manuscript should go for peer review or whether it should be desk rejected. And as has been said before, it may be that desk rejection is because the submitted manuscript is unsuitable for publication in the first instance, or complete mismatch with the aims and scope of the journal being submitted to. But if not, there's a decision to send the manuscript for peer review, apologies. Once the reviewer reports come in, the journal editor, associate editors decides on whether to publish or not on the basis of the reports, and then the author is informed of the decision. So this is in broad strokes the decision-making process, and I will specifically be focusing on this particular aspect in the second last aspect, where the journal editor now has to make a decision on the basis of the peer review reports. So reading the peer review reports, often the narrative reports we receive, and in most instances it would be 2 reports per article, sometimes 3, sometimes a bit more, but mostly 2 reports. At most journals, reviewers are asked to write a narrative report, as has been illustrated in the previous presentation, you know, a narrative report that goes into some detail about the strengths and limitations of the manuscript being reviewed. But then the reviewers will also be asked a range of other questions, and this may be in a manuscript, a manuscript submission form that accompanies the narrative report, or it may be in the form of, as in the case of the South African Journal of Science, it may be in the form of online questions that the reviewer is asked. But going back to the narrative reports, they do vary in quality and style. So in the previous instance, there were really good suggestions about how to write these reports in terms of how to structure them, the detailed process of reading. But it is important to note that, you know, people have varying amounts of time to spend with the review. And so they do vary quite a bit across the board. So it's useful to also look at, I think, some of the questions that reviewers are asked. And as I've indicated, South African Journal of Science is one example where we have a range of questions being asked about the manuscript. The most important one, really, and this is a question that the editor also asks when taking a first look at the paper and making a decision of whether it should be sent for review or not, is, does the manuscript fall within the scope of the journal? Does it speak to the audience, the readers of the journal? Is the manuscript written in a style that is suitable for and this is specific to SAJS, suitable for a non-specialist audience, and is it of wider interest than to specialists alone? Does it contain sufficient and novel, significant information to justify publication? And this would be a question asked of manuscripts across journals. Then questions about the title and the abstract, the research problem, is it sufficiently framed, methods described comprehensively for research articles, methods of analysis appropriate, interpretations and conclusions, and are the results and discussion confined to the relevance to the objectives. So reviewers then are also asked to rate. Okay, so these, as I've said, are questions that accompany the narrative report, and some of these would be elaborated in the narrative report. But these questions are useful because they give us as editors a kind of quick overview of the reviewer's assessment of the manuscript. So they also ask to rate what they think is this paper's overall contribution to the field, you know, whether it's excellent, good, or poor. Asked to provide commentary on language, grammar, whether appropriate or not, and on the overall quality of the manuscript. Okay, reviewers may also be asked questions about a range of other technical aspects of the manuscript, tables, figures, that kind of thing. And then often the report form that accompanies the narrative report for most journals would ask then also for a clear recommendation from the peer reviewer, so that you know, as I said, these reports, the narrative report varies in style. So some reviewers may be explicit in their report and say, I'm recommending a rejection of this paper, or I'm recommending acceptance with minor revisions, but others may omit that from the narrative report. So this section that asks for a clear recommendation is quite important, where reviewers now clearly state, on the basis of all of these questions they were asked, on the basis of their narrative report, do they recommend accept revisions, and these can be minor or major? Do they recommend a resubmission for a further round of review, or decline of the paper? So here are some possible outcomes after the review, and then I want to end off in the next slide. I'll talk about how, as a journal editor, you kind of integrate all of this information to make a decision about whether the paper should be accepted or not. So some possible outcomes: accept without any changes. The journal will publish the paper in its original form. I have to say, this is a rare outcome. Okay, it's really rare that two experts in your field, as well as the editor of the journal, thinks that the paper can be published as is. It's a really unlikely outcome. So none of us need to worry if we didn't, if that's not an outcome we received on any of the papers we've published. The second one is accept with minor revisions, and this is a good outcome, right? The journal has accepted the paper, accepted the paper, and will publish, but it's asking you to make some small revisions, and these could be revisions suggested by the reviewers, or it could be revisions suggested by the editor, or all of them. The third is a conditional acceptance. It's saying, we're asking you to make some substantive revisions to your paper, but we want to publish the paper regardless, right? So the authors are then asked to make the changes suggested by the reviewers or the editors. And once the paper comes back, it goes to the editor to assess the extent to which the revisions suggested were incorporated into the paper. Okay, so it's just an editorial review process after this. Another outcome is a conditional rejection, saying there's some merit in the paper, but the extent of the revisions are quite substantive, and we may reconsider this paper for publication. We're not saying we will publish, but we may consider it. But it does need to go through another round of review. Okay, so once the major changes which were recommended by reviewers and the editor have been made, it comes back, and then it either goes to the same reviewers if they're available to review, or it goes to different reviewers if the same reviewers are not available. So as a reviewer yourself, you will be asked, most journals will ask you, there's a form, a tick box that will ask you, are you available to review a revised version of this manuscript if necessary? And so that's where reviewers will indicate if they're available for a further round of review or not. And then the last and worst outcome would be an outright rejection. On the basis of the reviewer's reports, the editor recommends that the paper is rejected. It's not suitable for publication in the journal on the basis, it may be for a range of different reasons. Okay, then finally, the decisions we make as associate editors or editors emerge from our integrated reading of the reviewers' reports, right? So we would look at how they've kind of scored the manuscript on the checklist, but also read the narrative reports in detail. We also look, of course, at the recommendations they make, whether, you know, accept with revision or, you know. Then we also, as editors, do our own reading or assessment of the manuscript. And so often when we, and this involves the third point here, asking this question again that we asked at the beginning of the process, right? How does this fit with the aims and the scope of the journal and with the interest of its audience? So our own reading and assessment of the manuscript, you know, answers this specific question. Also will address a range of issues around, you know, just what makes a good paper in general, and make suggestions on the basis of that, so that the feedback that is sent to the authors is in the form of an editorial letter that that provides a summary of the changes the revisions being requested. Okay, and the summary would be an integration of what the reviewers are saying as well as what the editors are saying. And of course, it's important to note that reviewers don't always agree, that sometimes you have conflicting reports. One reviewer might recommend a publish with just minor revisions, whereas another reviewer might say decline. in instances like that, we often go and seek out additional reviews for the paper. So yes, so as an author, then you would receive an integrated letter that asks you on behalf of the journal to revise your paper according to the suggestions recommended by the reviewers, and that, you know, and that would be the kind of outcome of the decisions made by the editor. And yes, I think I'll end my input there. I look forward to the conversation with you.
Thank you so much, Floretta. I think it's important. I think with peer review, people always think about the word peer review and they forget that there's, you know, editors in the back end as well that need to work through those peer reviews to kind of make sense of it all and make a final decision on that submission. So thank you for just giving everyone a bit of insights into that process. We had one question that was specific to your presentation, but I think you did answer it in the end. So the question was just, if you have two conflicting review reports, how do you go about that? So I think you did answer it. If you want to add anything, you're welcome.
Yeah, yes, I'd like to just say that I think that unfortunately the issue about then seeking out additional reviewers is that it often lengthens the time. So, you know, often we have authors that are really patient with us for good reason, because sometimes the process is a long and drawn out one, and often it's the case where we're needing to seek out additional reviewers because we have conflicting reports.
Thank you for clarifying. And yes, I think that's the only time we have now for questions on this presentation. So we'll move on to the next item. Thank you, Floretta. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker. So that is Prof. Leslie Swartz, that you have seen and heard already. I want to introduce you to him properly. So Prof. Leslie Swartz is a clinical psychologist and professor of psychology at Stellenbosch University. He holds a PhD in psychology from University of Cape Town and a PhD in English from Stellenbosch University. He is the current editor-in-chief of the South African Journal of Science and was recently appointed editor-in-chief of the Scandinavian Journal of Disability. He was founding editor-in-chief of African Journal of Disability and serves as associate editor on a number of international journals. He publishes widely on disability and mental health, with an emphasis on sub-Saharan Africa, and holds an A rating as a researcher from the National Research Foundation. He has an ongoing interest in research capacity development and has run research writing training courses at a number of universities in South Africa and further afield in Africa. Thank you so much, Leslie. I hand over to you.
Thanks very much. Nadia, we're due to finish by 4. I'm correct, hey? So I'm going to try and keep this short. I just want to thank all the previous speakers. It's always difficult to go after so many good speakers, so there's going to be a little bit of repetition, but I'm going to try and go through this as quickly as possible, because I think the most important thing is to deal with your queries, and I'm very pleased to see that there have been lots of queries in the chat. Okay, so let's go. So just to recap a little bit, peer review is absolutely central to the whole academic exercise. So I know you're under a lot of pressure to write articles and so on, but peer review is as important as writing articles, because it's the only mechanism that we really have for quality control. And as a number of my colleagues have said, we're actually in a bit of a crisis regarding peer review. We can't find peer reviewers, and if we can't find peer reviewers, journals can't continue to function. So who are these peers? And I can already see in the chat, people have a kind of fantasy that, you know, peer reviewers are some sort of special kind of being, but everyone on this call is a peer. Peer just means somebody who's similar to other people. So the minute we start publishing, we all have a responsibility to keep the peer review system going. And just to reiterate what I think Gemma said at the beginning, for me, every time I expect somebody to review something that I've submitted to a journal, I should be prepared to review somebody else's work. And if we were to do that, then the peer review system would work really well. So I think about myself as an author. I am an editor. I review things, but I also write, like all of you, and I get rejections all the time, like all of you. What do I want from a peer reviewer? Well, I want somebody who knows what they're doing. I want somebody who's constructive, who's not going to be rude. And we heard about from Carody and about the swearing and rudeness. I want somebody who's fair, who's kind, who's clear in what they say, but who's focused really. What do I want? I want somebody who's going to help me make my work better, even if the decision from the peer reviewer is, we're not going to accept this. I want that peer review to help me to be better next time. I do not want a peer reviewer who's trying to turn me into them, who's trying to push their own agenda through the peer review. So I think what a number of you have already said in the chat is, well, you know, the biggest fear of people who come on a course like this is when am I going to be good enough? And it's in the nature of academic life that we all feel, and I'm old, I've got lots of publications, I still often feel like I'm an imposter. And I often say the only people in academia who don't think that they're imposters and that they're fooling people, that they know what they're doing, are people who really don't know what they're doing. So you've got to realize everyone has a bit of issues of confidence around peer reviewing, and you've just got to jump in and do it. There are old-fashioned ideas of academic hierarchy. So historically, people say only professors can do peer review. That's not true. It's peer review. So really, what you need to think about as a peer reviewer is, in order to review this particular article in front of me that I've asked to review, what do I really need to know and what don't I really need to know? And it's absolutely fine if you're a peer reviewer and you get an article to review and there's certain aspects you feel competent to deal with most of it, but there's one aspect, like you're getting something that's dealing with issues in a country and you don't know the issues in that country, or there are some small issues of methodology that you don't understand, you can actually put in your peer review, I can say this and this and this about these things, about this aspect of what has been sent to me to be peer review. I can't give an opinion about that because I don't know about it. You don't have to pretend. I remember I was asked to review something for The Lancet, which is a very highly rated medical journal once. And I read this thing and it was just brilliant. I mean, I had nothing bad to say. And I kept on thinking, I'm the peer reviewer, people are going to think I'm silly if I say that there should be no changes. But eventually I was honest. I just said, I thought this was excellent. I recommend no changes. As Floretta's mentioned, this is extremely rare. And I was so relieved because, in fact, there were two other reviewers and we all said the same thing. But you don't have to be something that you aren't in order to become a peer reviewer. You may not be sure that you're the right person to review something. So you've got to make that decision. So the first thing that I do when I get sent something to review, I look at it quickly, and then I think, what can I do and what can't I do? And my question always is not, am I on top of absolutely every single tiny thing in this article, but how important is what I can do as a reviewer to helping the author and the journal? And how much of a barrier is what I can't do to my ability to be helpful? And if the barrier is greater, I really don't know anything about this, then I say, sorry, I can't do it. But if I'm still not sure, then I'll write to the editor. And as an editor, I always welcome questions like this and say, look, I think I can be helpful in this way, but I don't think I can be helpful in that way. And then the editor can say, well, go ahead, or we'll approach somebody else. We're grateful that you're engaging with us as journals, and we want to work with you. There's a very interesting recent article, and I've put the reference on there so you can look at it up later. And they've in fact got some nice resources that you can look at. And they call a reviewer a peer mentor. So you're somebody who's helping people. You're not expected to know everything, but make it clear as a reviewer what you do and don't know. And you have to ask yourself 4 main things. Do I, as the reviewer, understand the methods that are being used here? Because good understanding of methods is what's at the heart of research, scientific or otherwise. I'm kind of standing in as a reviewer for the readership of this journal. So am I a representative of this journal? And one of the ways that you can find this out is look at other articles that have already been published in the journal for which you're reviewing, and see whether you kind of fit with those articles. Do I know enough about the content of this work to be able to make a judgment? And this is more a question actually that you ask in some senses about the way in which the article has been, or the submission has been written. Have the authors told me enough about the context of the work so that I can make an assessment? So I'm quite aware that I often review stuff from other African countries, and the context isn't explained enough for me in order to make a proper assessment of what is going on. Now, the whole business of peer reviewing, just like the business of writing for journals, is often seen as very lonely, but you're not actually alone. As a journal editor, I welcome it when reviewers say to me, look, I'm going to need help with this review, or I'm going to use this submission as an opportunity to work with one of my doctoral students or master students so they get experience in peer reviewing. Always, always ask the editor if you're wanting to show something that you've been sent for review to somebody else, because there are confidentiality concerns and issues of respect for authors. Another practice, which is a very bad practice, but I'm afraid it does happen, is some people will just give, without telling the editor, they'll give a submission to their PhD student or their master student, get that student to write the review and then send the review in under their own name. And that's not actually ethical, because they're exploiting junior reviewers. So remember your rights, because many of you on this call are junior, but remember those of the authors and those of the journal. But there are ways of working together to develop your skills as a peer reviewer. Well, you've done the first step, you've come to this webinar, but there are some options. As a ask your sorry, it's a mistake in my typing. Ask your supervisor or a more experienced colleague in your department or somebody that you know in your field. Say, hey, next time you get something to review, won't you let me help you review it, because I want to learn more about peer reviewing. Similarly, you get something to review and you think, oh, I'm really interested in doing this, but I don't feel I've got all the skills, but I do know X person has got the skills. Ask the editor, and if it's okay with the editor, ask your supervisor or somebody more senior, won't you help me with this review? Or develop peer review buddy systems. And the peer review buddy system is a way of, as a group, developing your reviewing skills. So how do peer review buddy systems work? Well, for those of you who've been on other webinars of ours about writing, it's similar to writing support systems, where you sit and you work together with other people, like Shut Up and Write programs where you write together. It's also very helpful to be a member of a journal club where you and colleagues are looking at and reviewing and discussing methodologies in journals in your field. But with a peer review buddy system, even before you actually start doing actual peer reviews, say that you and colleagues of yours in your field, you will peer review the reviews that you've got from journals. So if I'm part of a buddy system, I send something to a journal, I get reviews back. They may think I'm great, they may reject. And what I'll do is I will share what I've written and the review with my colleagues, and my colleagues will comment on the competence, respectfulness, constructiveness of the review. So you're all getting experience in your group of what different kinds of peer reviews look like, and you can suggest in your group ways in which you think reviews could have been improved. Then if you're actually going to use this as a method for doing actual reviews, remember you first ask the editor, please may I do this, and these are the people who are going to be in my group, and this is how going to be do it. First of all, establish that your group is going to be confidential. Get this permission from the editor. Then what I suggest that you do in your group is each of you independently just look quickly at the submission and say, okay, these are the main things that need to be covered in the review of this article. Distribute those tasks. Then have a look at what each of you have written in terms of those tasks. Then one of you will put together a review and you'll write back to the journal and say, I'm taking responsibility for this, but in writing this review, as I discussed with you, the following 3 people were also involved in this process of review. In summary, this is not my slide. I've taken it from this way et al. And it just repeats what my colleagues have said. Write supportively, but be clear. Summarize what you as a reviewer understand of the work. Explain why you've made your recommendations or ratings. Base your impressions on actual content. So show the reader, show the author why you are making the decisions that you make. Be careful to focus on strengths and weaknesses, and particularly when you're talking about weaknesses, you can't say the logic is terrible here. Give specific examples where there are problems and show how they can make it better. So provide suggestions for improvement. Be as detailed and as clear as you can. I often say, it's, my heart sinks as an author when I get a very long peer review. But generally when I get a long peer review, it's because people have done these things and it's the most helpful peer review. And explain things. So to say insufficient methods, that doesn't tell the author anything. Explain what is wrong with the methods. So finally, I'm a journal editor, as are my colleagues. Please don't undermine the peer review process while it is underway. So if you are an author and you disagree with peer reviewers, you can give your responses, but give us feedback, give journals also feedback on your experience of being reviewed. Please give us feedback on your peer review experiences, good and bad. It's very nice for me as an editor to hear from an author, oh, that person peer reviewed my piece. They didn't recommend that it be accepted, but it was really helpful for me. Or this wasn't helpful. And we constantly need to improve the processes of peer review. So we actually need to peer review. But I've tried to leave a little bit of time so that we can have some questions and comments. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Leslie. I think, as you've rightly mentioned, it's always a question of confidence. I think with everything in life, it's that first time or those first few times always daunting. But important to know you don't have to do it alone. And thank you for showing them ways that they can bring in support from, other networks and more senior people, perhaps. So thank you for that. Okay, so we do have a question and answer session for about 10 minutes or so. So this is aimed at all speakers, so please feel free to unmute yourself. It's not for anyone specifically. So we had one question from Francois. Where does one find a third-party peer reviewer?
Okay, well, I'm not, maybe I can just address that because I saw that earlier and I was hoping to answer it. Where does one find a third party? I'm not quite sure what you mean, Francois, but if you are asked by, if you as an author are asked by a journal to suggest reviewers, it's really generally people in your field whose work you respect and that you like. It's not your job to ask them, but generally you will suggest peer reviewers from people whose work you read and you admire and so on, and that's exactly what I will do. I think Floretta, or I can't remember who mentioned this. This is what we do as editors. So when you send something to us, we see who are you citing. We will look for similar articles in our journal, on Google Scholar, or on other sites, and we will look for people who are working in a similar area. So it's usually you're reading the work of third-party reviewers anyway. Yeah. I don't know if anybody else wants to deal with that, or Nadia, if that's enough.
No, well, if anyone else wants to jump in, they're welcome. Just give it a second. No, I think you've covered everything, Leslie. Then we had another question from Itumeleng. So Itumeleng asks, is it necessary to explore the peer review research literature if the journal has outlined review criteria already?
I'm just struggling to understand the question. Maybe Floretta, I think you're going to save me. Thank you, Floretta.
No, I think Itumeleng's question came as Karadi was speaking. I think it was quite specific to Karadi's presentation. But no, Itumeleng, yes, you would follow the style asked for by the journal. So you would use the guidelines that the journal offers. I think Karadi was saying, you know, if you need guidance on how to structure your report, or, you know, you just want to you want to write a good report, then yes, definitely you can go and search. But usually the journal's guidelines are sufficient.
Thank you, Floretta. I know some of the questions have been answered already. I'm just going to take one that I think a lot of people might be interested in, and perhaps they did miss the answer. But I think the question was, how do you become a peer reviewer for a journal, or how do you get involved? Do you have to reach out, you know, that process? So perhaps just a few tips for people to get started, get on those databases of the journals.
Okay, maybe I'll just start on this one again because I've got such a big mouth. If there are journals you like and respect, editors welcome send your CV to the editor, tell the editor this is what I'm interested in doing that, and then the editor may or may not call on you, but then you can get on the database of reviewers. I mean, just to say, I think, you know, Floretta emphasized this, we are really struggling to find peer reviewers, so please do volunteer. But Floretta, I can see you wanting to say.
Yes, we really do struggle, and you will read Leslie's recent, I think it was editorial about peer review week, and how there is really a sense in which everyone's stretched, and we struggle. But I wanted to add to your point about, Leslie, about how we find reviewers. And it just occurred to me that you could also speak to if you're a PhD candidate or a postdoc working with someone, you could also speak to them, your supervisor, and let them know that you're really keen on reviewing, because often they receive a lot of invitations that they can't humanly commit to. And I'm speaking from my own experience as a supervisor. I'd love to be able to recommend that journals reach out to my students who have expertise in the particular areas that they're working in. So that's another way to make yourself accessible to journals as a reviewer.
Thanks, Floretta. We have another question from Stephen, which is a very, the answers can be many, but I actually have, I think, something to add there as well. But what is the main challenge you face with authors? So maybe just to start off the discussion, just something I've always noted in terms of when you resubmit, or when authors resubmit their revisions, they don't always respond to all the reviewer comments. We ask them to have a point-by-point response, even if perhaps you don't agree with something, or you didn't decide to include it because of a specific reason. It's just important to acknowledge that you have seen that comment from the reviewer and you decided not to include it for these reasons, or you did. So I think for me, just responding to all of the reviewer comments, it just expedites the process for everyone to see, that you've taken the feedback into account. But yeah, open for anyone else to add.
Can I just say, well, I mean, this is it's slightly off point, but please look at the scope of the journal. So, for example, at the South African Journal of Science, because I thought, Nadia, you were going to say a different thing. We get many submissions that don't deal with African issues, and it says in our scope that's what we deal with. We're not going to look. So look at that. And I'm just, one of the other journals I edit is a disability journal, and we get many submissions that have got nothing to do with disability. You're wasting your time and the journal's time by sending to the wrong journal. Yeah. So that's.
I think I am just looking for some more questions, perhaps.
Nadia, I see
Yes,
a question.
please.
It's more than one question actually that's come up. The one is, do we comment on grammar and language? And then another question is, do we check citations and references? And to follow on from Karidi's earlier points about, you're not the copy editor. It's not necessarily your job to be checking grammar and language. But as far as grammar and language speak to the quality of the manuscript, then it's your job as a peer reviewer to not necessarily correct it, but to provide some commentary to say, this paper does need a proper edit before it can be considered for publication. So you can provide commentary. There's no expectation that you're inserting commas and doing that work, although some reviewers do, so it does vary. And on the other point about references and citations, I think there's also, it also does vary, but it comes down to the same point. If the manuscript doesn't meet with the style, the referencing style of the journal, if there are so many missing references and incorrect citations, then it again speaks to the quality of the manuscript. And then it is your job to make the editors aware.
A journal with a low impact factor is really not an issue and not something you need to worry about. We have to review for all journals. It's the service we put out there.
There are lots of unanswered questions, and I'm afraid we've lost our chair. But one of the things that I want to say, firstly, I want to thank Gemma and Floretta and Karidi and everyone for your participation, and particularly Linda, who put this together in her absence. She didn't put it together in her absence. I want to thank Linda in her absence for putting this together, and Nadia for chairing so well for us. I will stay on and try and answer the remaining questions in the Q&A. But now that you're on our list, everyone who's on the list here will be invited. We have a regular, every month, we have an open forum. It's just for an hour on issues about academic publishing. And we've tended to focus quite a lot on writing, but we would love to take questions about peer reviewing and so on. We will very shortly be, Linda will upload this, the recording of this meeting onto our website, and you will get the links to the recording so that you can look back at it. And we've obviously just starting a conversation. We're always interested to hear from people, even if it's not today. What do you still need? What more do you need? Because part of our role as the as journal editors and as the South African Journal of Science is to increase participation in science at all levels and to diversify it. So please help us to help you, and please peer review us. So you will also be asked to give an assessment of what was helpful and what wasn't. So I'm going to say goodbye to everyone. Thank you very much indeed to everybody. I'm going to try and just answer the remaining Q&A questions, but thank you very much, and may this be one of many engagements with all of you. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.